When I turned 18, I was forced to enter a death competition called the Proving. My entire town watches teenagers get hunted for sport. They called it the Proving, and it happened every summer when the island's fog was thickest. If you turned 18 before the summer solstice, any adult over 60 could nominate you as prey. They didn't need a reason beyond wanting to watch you run for your life through the wilderness while they hunted you with whatever weapons they could carry. The whole thing was supposed to teach us respect for our elders and prepare us for the harsh realities of adulthood. Really, it was just legalized murder disguised as tradition. Our island of Thornwick had been isolated from the mainland for over 2 centuries, and in that time, we developed our own twisted customs that the outside world would never understand or accept. I spent my entire senior year of high school watching other kids transform into paranoid wrecks as their 18th birthdays approached. Some started sucking up to every adult they met, hoping to avoid nomination through sheer brown-nosing. Others tried to get themselves injured badly enough to be medically exempt, though the council rarely accepted anything short of paralysis as a valid excuse. A few attempted to hide their real birth dates or forge documents proving they were younger, but the island kept meticulous records going back generations. There was no escaping the Proving once you came of age. The ferry to the mainland only ran twice a week, and attempting to leave before your 18th Proving was considered an act of cowardice that would result in your entire family being exiled. My name is Marcus Fletcher, and I made it to May 15th without getting nominated. I was working as an assistant to Edgar Walsh, an ancient photography shop owner who complained constantly about my generation's work ethic while his arthritic hands shook too badly to operate his own equipment. Every day after school, I cleaned his lenses and organized his supplies while he ranted about participation trophies and social media. The pay was terrible, but I figured if I kept him happy until the solstice, I'd be safe for another year. Edgar had never nominated anyone in his 40 years of eligibility, preferring to grumble about young people from the sidelines rather than actively hunting them through the forest. The nomination ceremony took place in Thornwick's town square, where a massive wooden platform had been erected specifically for the occasion. Mayor Catherine Drexel, a woman whose idea of mercy was using a smaller caliber bullet, stood behind a podium while the entire adult population gathered below. She held a leather-bound book containing the names of every 18-year-old on the island, and one by one, she called for nominations. When adults wanted to nominate someone, they had to stand up and publicly declare their choice, along with their reasoning. The crowd always cheered louder for the more creative justifications, as if ruining a teenager's life was performance art. I was photographing the ceremony for Edgar's historical archive when Mayor Drexel called my name. My stomach dropped as Dr. Hamilton Pierce stood up from the crowd, his silver hair catching the afternoon sunlight. He was our island's only surgeon, a man whose steady hands had saved dozens of lives over his 50-year career. He was also completely insane when it came to the Proving, having personally killed more teenagers than any other hunter in Thornwick's history. His reasoning for nominating me was simple and terrifying. He claimed I'd been spreading dangerous ideas about reforming our traditions, though I'd never spoken publicly about the Proving. Apparently, he'd overheard me complaining to my girlfriend about the barbaric nature of our customs, and he decided that made me a threat to our way of life. The crowd erupted in approval as my nomination was officially recorded. Dr. Pierce smiled at me from across the square, and I could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. He'd been watching me for months, waiting for any excuse to add my name to his collection. I looked around desperately for support, but even Edgar avoided eye contact. The old bastard had probably known this was coming and decided not to warn me. After the ceremony, I had exactly 72 hours to prepare before the Proving began. Most nominees spent this time writing goodbye letters to their families and getting their affairs in order. I spent it planning how to survive the night that was designed to kill me. My girlfriend, Scarlett Morrison, had been nominated by Helen Cross, the island's head librarian who apparently disapproved of Scarlett's campaign to modernize our school's curriculum. Scarlett was brilliant, resourceful, and absolutely fearless, which made her both an ideal ally and Dr. Pierce's second-choice target. She'd been studying the Proving for years, documenting survival strategies and mapping every cave, abandoned building, and hiding spot on the island. If anyone could help me make it through the night, it was her. Our third ally was Tommy Rodriguez, whose nomination came courtesy of his own grandfather. Tommy had apparently embarrassed the family name by getting caught smoking behind the church, which in his grandfather's mind warranted a death sentence. The three of us met at the old lighthouse on the northern coast to finalize our survival strategy. The building had been abandoned for decades after the automated beacon made the lighthouse keeper obsolete, but the structure was still sound and offered an excellent view of the surrounding coastline. Scarlett spread out a detailed map of the island that she'd been working on for months, marking every potential hiding spot, escape route, and dangerous area. The forest that covered most of Thornwick was dense enough to provide cover, but filled with natural hazards that had claimed plenty of nominees over the years. The coastal cliffs offered spectacular views and certain death if you made one wrong step in the darkness. According to the rules, nominees had exactly 1 hour to leave the town limits before the hunting began. We could take basic supplies, but no weapons, communication devices, or anything that could give us an unfair advantage. The hunters, meanwhile, were allowed to use whatever equipment they wanted, from simple knives to high-powered rifles with night vision scopes. The only restriction was that they couldn't enter certain designated safe zones, mainly the hospital and the elementary school, though these areas were too obvious to provide any real protection. Most nominees who tried hiding in safe zones were simply starved out or killed the moment they emerged. The smart money was on staying mobile and avoiding detection until sunrise, when the Proving officially ended and survivors were welcomed back into society as full adults. Dr. Pierce had participated in 43 previous Provings and had never failed to kill his nominee. He was methodical, patient, and completely ruthless in his pursuit. hunt. Unlike the younger hunters who relied on brute force and intimidation, Dr. Pierce approached the proving like a surgical procedure. He studied his targets for weeks beforehand, learning their habits, fears, and psychological weak points. During the hunt itself, he used psychological warfare as much as physical violence, often driving nominees to make fatal mistakes through carefully orchestrated mind games. Tommy's older brother had been one of Dr. Pierce's victims 3 years earlier, and the family still hadn't recovered from watching the doctor systematically break down their son's will to live before finally putting him out of his misery. The morning of the proving dawned gray and misty, with thick fog rolling in from the ocean to blanket the entire island in an oppressive haze. Visibility was reduced to maybe 30 feet in any direction, which could work either for or against us, depending on how well we used the cover. Scarlett, Tommy, and I spent the day making final preparations and trying to stay calm while the entire town buzzed with anticipation. By evening, carnival-style booths had been set up around the town square, where adults could buy food, drinks, and betting sheets to wager on which nominees would die first. The whole thing felt like a medieval festival, where the entertainment was watching children get murdered by their neighbors. At exactly 9 p.m., Mayor Drexel rang the ancient bronze bell that signaled the beginning of our head start. The 7 of us who'd been nominated that year stood at the edge of the town square, facing the dark wilderness beyond the streetlights. Tommy was visibly shaking, and 2 of the other nominees looked like they were about to pass out from terror. Only Scarlett seemed completely composed, her jaw set with determination as she squeezed my hand one final time. We'd agreed to split up initially to avoid giving the hunters multiple targets, then rendezvous at the lighthouse once the pursuit began. The plan was solid, but plans rarely survived contact with people who were actively trying to kill you. I ran north along the coastal road until I reached the old fishing pier, then doubled back through the forest to confuse anyone who might be tracking my initial route. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own feet, which made navigation nearly impossible but also provided perfect concealment. Every sound seemed amplified in the mist, from the snap of twigs under my boots to the distant crash of waves against the rocks below. I made it to within half a mile of the lighthouse when the bell rang again, signaling that the hunters were now free to begin their pursuit. Somewhere in that fog, Dr. Pierce was beginning his methodical approach to killing me, and I had no idea where he was or what he was planning. The first gunshot echoed across the island at 10:23 p.m., followed by a scream that cut off abruptly. Someone was already dead, though I couldn't tell who from the sound. More shots followed over the next hour, along with shouts and the baying of hunting dogs that some of the more enthusiastic participants brought along for tracking. The fog muffled and distorted every sound, making it impossible to determine which direction the violence was coming from. I pressed myself against a massive oak tree and tried to control my breathing, while my heart hammered against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to keep running, but moving blindly through the forest would only increase my chances of stumbling into a hunter or falling off a cliff. Tommy arrived at the lighthouse first, materializing out of the fog like a ghost, with his dark hair plastered to his skull and his clothes torn from pushing through the underbrush. He was bleeding from scratches on his face and arms, but seemed uninjured otherwise. Scarlett appeared 20 minutes later, moving silently through the mist with the grace of someone who'd spent years exploring every inch of this island. She reported seeing at least 3 hunters working their way systematically through the southern forest, but no sign of Dr. Pierce. That worried me more than if she'd spotted him immediately, because it meant he was being patient and strategic rather than rushing into the hunt like the others. We decided to stay at the lighthouse until dawn, figuring the elevated position would give us advance warning of anyone approaching while the fog provided concealment. The building's windows had been boarded up years ago, but we found a small opening on the second floor that offered a limited view of the surrounding area. Tommy produced a thermos of coffee from his pack, and we took turns keeping watch while the others tried to rest. None of us actually slept, though. Every sound could be a hunter approaching, and the knowledge that people we'd known our entire lives were actively trying to murder us made relaxation impossible. The fog began to thin slightly as the night progressed, which increased visibility but also made us more exposed. At 2:47 a.m., we heard voices approaching from the south. 2 hunters were moving through the forest below the lighthouse, using flashlights to examine the ground for tracks. I recognized one voice as belonging to Robert Chen, Tommy's grandfather, while the other was unfamiliar. They were discussing the best approach to the lighthouse, debating whether anyone would be stupid enough to hide in such an obvious location. Tommy's face went white as he listened to his own grandfather casually planning his murder, describing how he'd prefer to use a knife rather than a gun for a more personal kill. The conversation made it clear that this wasn't just about tradition or coming-of-age rituals. These people genuinely enjoyed the hunt and the fear they inspired in their young victims. Scarlett motioned for us to move to the 3rd floor as the voices grew closer. The lighthouse's spiral staircase was made of rusted metal that creaked ominously under our weight, but we managed to reach the lamp room at the top without making too much noise. From there, we could see the hunters moving around the base of the building, examining the ground with their flashlights. One of them tried the door, which we'd barricaded from the inside with debris, but they didn't seem committed to forcing their way in. After about 10 minutes of searching, they moved on to continue their sweep of the coastline. We remained perfectly still for another hour, afraid that the slightest sound might bring them back. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, we thought we might actually make it through the night. The official end of the proving was sunrise, marked by the ringing of the town bell and the safe return of any survivors. We'd been listening to sporadic gunfire throughout the night, but the sounds had gradually died away as the hours passed. Either the hunters had found all their targets, or the remaining nominees had found secure hiding places. Tommy was starting to relax, even managing a few minutes of actual sleep against the lighthouse wall, when Scarlett spotted movement in the tree line below. A lone figure was approaching the lighthouse, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had all the time in the world. Dr. Pierce stepped out of the fog like death incarnate, his medical bag slung over one shoulder and a hunting rifle cradled in his arms. He wasn't hurrying or searching frantically like the other hunters had been. Instead, he walked directly to the lighthouse door with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where his prey was hiding. He examined the barricade we'd constructed, then called out in that calm, professional voice that had comforted patients for decades. He explained that he'd been tracking us since the hunt began, following our trail through the forest with the same methodical precision he used for surgery. He knew we were inside, and he knew we had nowhere left to run. The doctor began describing what he planned to do to us once he gained entry to the lighthouse. His voice carried clearly through the fog as he detailed the specific tortures he'd perfected over his years of participating in the proving. He spoke about previous nominees he'd caught, describing their final moments with the clinical detachment of someone discussing a medical procedure. Tommy was shaking so badly I could hear his teeth chattering, while Scarlett gripped her knife with white knuckles. Dr. Pierce continued his psychological assault for nearly an hour, alternating between promises of quick deaths if we surrendered and graphic descriptions of prolonged suffering if he had to come find us. When the sun finally crested the horizon, painting the fog in shades of gold and orange, the town bell began to ring in the distance. The proving was officially over, and we were still alive. Dr. Pierce fell silent below us, and when I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, he was gone. We waited another 30 minutes before venturing down to the ground floor, afraid that his disappearance was another psychological trick. The fog was burning off rapidly as the sun rose higher, revealing the lighthouse standing alone on the rocky promontory, with no sign that anyone else had ever been there. We'd survived our first proving, earning our place as full members of Thornwick society, but the experience had fundamentally changed us in ways I was only beginning to understand. The walk back to town should have felt triumphant, but instead it was haunting. We passed evidence of the night's violence scattered throughout the forest, torn clothing hanging from branches, dark stains on rocks that might have been blood, and in one clearing, a single sneaker that belonged to Maria Santos, one of our fellow nominees. We never found out what happened to Maria, though her body was discovered 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine, with injuries consistent with falling from a great height. The official cause of death was listed as accidental, but everyone knew she'd been pushed. 2 other nominees besides Maria had died during the night, bringing the total mortality rate to just over 40%, which was considered average for the proving. The town square was decorated with banners and streamers when we arrived, and the adult population had gathered to welcome the survivors back into society. Mayor Drexel made a speech about tradition, maturity, and the importance of respecting our elders, but her words felt hollow after everything we'd experienced. Dr. Pierce was there among the crowd, smiling and applauding as if he hadn't spent the night trying to torture us to death. When our eyes met across the square, he nodded respectfully and raised his hat in greeting. The casual normalcy of his behavior was more disturbing than his threats had been. To him, hunting teenagers was just another civic duty, no different from serving on the town council or volunteering at the hospital. Over the following weeks, I began to understand the true purpose of the proving. It wasn't really about creating stronger adults or maintaining traditions. It was about breaking the spirit of anyone who might challenge the established order. The nominees who survived learned to keep their heads down and accept whatever the older generation demanded, no matter how unreasonable or cruel. Those who died were eliminated before they could grow up to question the system or inspire others to resist. The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors served as a permanent reminder of what happened to people who stepped out of line. Tommy never fully recovered from hearing his grandfather describe how he wanted to kill him, and he spent the rest of his life trying to earn approval from a man who'd literally hunted him through the forest. Scarlett and I began secretly documenting everything we could about the proving, interviewing other survivors, and researching the history of our island's traditions. What we discovered was disturbing beyond anything we'd imagined during our night in the lighthouse. The mortality rates had been steadily increasing over the past 50 years as the older generation became more aggressive in their methods. Medical records showed that many survivors suffered from severe psychological trauma that never fully healed, leading to high rates of suicide and substance abuse among the adult population. The island's birth rate had been declining for decades as young people either fled to the mainland or decided not to bring children into a world where they might be murdered for entertainment. The most horrifying discovery was that the proving wasn't actually an ancient tradition at all. It had been implemented in 1952 by a group of World War II veterans who wanted to ensure that subsequent generations would be tough enough to handle whatever challenges life threw at them. The entire mythology about centuries-old customs was fabricated to give the ritual legitimacy and make it seem like an immutable part of island culture. The real purpose was social control, using terror to maintain the power structure that kept the older generation in charge while suppressing any attempts at reform or modernization. Every adult on the island knew the truth, but they'd been so thoroughly indoctrinated into the system that they genuinely believed the torture of children was necessary for the greater good. Dr. Pierce continued his career as both a healer and a killer, saving lives in his medical practice while ending them during the proving. The duality never seemed to bother him, as if he'd compartmentalized the two aspects of his personality so completely that they never came into conflict. He'd often treat the injuries of previous nominees who'd barely escaped his attempts to kill them, discussing their wounds with the same professional concern he'd show any other patient. Some survivors even credited him with excellent medical care, apparently unable to reconcile the doctor who'd stitched their wounds with the hunter who'd inflicted them in the first place. By the time time I turned 25, Scarlett and I had collected enough evidence to expose the truth about the proving to the outside world. We documented dozens of deaths that had been covered up as accidents, interviewed survivors who'd been traumatized by their experiences, and uncovered the historical records that proved the whole tradition was less than a century old. We also had testimony from several adults who'd grown disgusted with the system and were willing to speak publicly about its true nature. Our plan was to smuggle the information to mainland authorities who could investigate the island and put an end to the ritualized murder of children. But first, we had to survive long enough to get off Thornwick without being stopped by people who had every reason to want us silenced. The night before we planned to leave for the mainland, Dr. Pierce appeared at my door. He'd aged considerably over the past 7 years, his silver hair now completely white and his hands showing the first signs of the tremor that would eventually end his surgical career. But his eyes were as sharp as ever, and his voice carried the same calm authority that had terrified me during my proving. He explained that he knew about our investigation and our plans to expose the island's secrets to the outside world. He said he admired our dedication and thoroughness, complimenting us on the quality of our research. Then he told us we had 24 hours to destroy everything we'd collected and abandon our plans, or we'd face the consequences of betraying our community's trust. Scarlett and I spent that night debating what to do. We could flee to the mainland immediately and hope the authorities would protect us, but that would mean abandoning Tommy and the other survivors who'd helped with our investigation. We could stay and fight, but that would almost certainly mean facing some form of unofficial punishment that might include becoming the targets of an off-season hunt. Or we could pretend to comply while secretly continuing our work, though Dr. Pierce was far too intelligent to be fooled by such obvious deception. Every option carried enormous risks, and we had no way of knowing which choice would give us the best chance of survival while still accomplishing our goal of stopping the proving. In the end, we decided to gamble everything on a single desperate plan. We would attend the next nomination ceremony and publicly reveal everything we'd learned about the proving's true history and purpose. The entire adult population would be gathered in one place, along with visiting mainland officials who came to observe our unique cultural traditions. If we could present our evidence before the crowd and get it recorded by outside observers, the truth would finally be exposed regardless of what happened to us afterward. It was almost certainly a suicide mission, but it might be the only way to ensure that future generations of children wouldn't have to endure the same terror we'd experienced. The nomination ceremony proceeded normally until Mayor Drexel called for the reading of the traditional opening statement about honoring our ancestors and maintaining island customs. That's when Scarlett stood up and began speaking in a clear, carrying voice about the fabricated history of the proving and its true purpose as a tool of social control. The crowd initially thought she was making some kind of joke, but as she continued presenting evidence and specific details about covered-up murders, the atmosphere in the square began to change. Some adults looked genuinely shocked to learn the truth about traditions they'd participated in their entire lives, while others seemed angry that their carefully maintained lies were being exposed. Dr. Pierce rose from his seat near the platform and began walking toward Scarlett with purposeful strides. His face showed no emotion, but his right hand was reaching inside his coat for something that was almost certainly a weapon. I jumped up and began shouting everything I knew about the doctor's personal involvement in multiple murders, describing in detail how he'd hunted and killed teenagers over the past 4 decades. Other survivors started speaking up as well, adding their own testimonies about the psychological trauma they'd endured and the friends they'd lost to the proving's brutality. The mainland officials were frantically taking notes and making phone calls, clearly realizing they'd stumbled into something much more serious than a quaint cultural ceremony. The confrontation that followed was chaotic and terrifying, but it was also the beginning of the end for the proving. Within a week, federal investigators had arrived on the island to begin collecting evidence of the ritualized murders that had been taking place for decades. Dr. Pierce and several other prominent hunters were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. The mayor and town council members were removed from office and replaced by mainland administrators who began the process of integrating Thornwick into normal society. Most importantly, the proving was permanently banned, ensuring that no future generations of children would be forced to run for their lives through the fog while their elders hunted them for sport. But the scars left by decades of terror would take much longer to heal. Many adult survivors struggled with severe psychological trauma that affected every aspect of their lives. The island's culture had been so thoroughly poisoned by violence and fear that rebuilding a healthy society required years of therapy, education, and patient work to undo the damage. Some older residents never accepted the changes and spent their remaining years bitter and resentful that their traditions had been taken away from them. They genuinely believed that ending the proving would make future generations weak and unprepared for life's challenges, unable to understand that terrorizing children had never been necessary or beneficial. Tommy eventually left the island for good, unable to live in the same place where his own grandfather had tried to murder him. He became a social worker on the mainland, dedicating his life to helping other survivors of childhood trauma. Scarlett and I stayed on Thornwick for several more years, working with the federal administrators to document the full extent of the damage and help other survivors begin the healing process. We married eventually and had 2 children who grew up in a world where adults protected them rather than hunting them through the forest. Our kids will never know the terror of waiting for their 18th birthday and wondering if they'll survive to see 19, and that knowledge makes all the risks we took seem worthwhile. Dr. Pierce died in federal prison while awaiting trial, his body finally succumbing to the cancer he'd been hiding for years. His death was ruled natural causes, though some people suspected he'd found a way to end his own life rather than face justice for the children he'd indeed murdered. I felt no satisfaction when I heard the news, only a profound sadness that so many lives had been destroyed by one man's twisted interpretation of strength and tradition. The doctor had genuinely believed he was helping to create better adults by terrorizing children, unable to see that he was actually destroying the very qualities he claimed to value. His legacy was a generation of traumatized survivors and a community so damaged by violence that it took decades to recover. The last proving ceremony was held in the form of a memorial service for all the teenagers who died during the decades of ritualized murder. We read their names aloud, shared their stories, and planted a tree for each victim in what became known as the Memorial Grove. The fog still rolls in from the ocean during summer nights, but now it brings peace rather than terror. Children play in the same forests where their older siblings once ran for their lives, and the lighthouse that sheltered us during our darkest hour has been restored as a symbol of survival and hope. The bronze bell still rings at sunrise, but instead of marking the end of a night of horror, it celebrates the beginning of each new day in a community finally free from the traditions that once threatened to destroy it.